Hi. Well, it's supposedly below zero here in Lugano, where we still are. But the sun is out, and look, I don't even have to wear gloves. So that's the nice thing about Switzerland and why people go skiing. But today, we're going to have what could be an interesting topic for you. It's memories of an American kid in whose childhood was in World War II in the Midwest USA. That was me. And so I can tell you a lot of things that you never see in movies. And I'll start right now. First of all, I was in, during World War II, before the U.S. ever got into it, I was in kindergarten and first grade and second grade. And then the U.S. got in the war, and life changed quite a bit. Before the war, I kind of don't even, I was so young, I don't even remember much. But I do remember being in kindergarten, and there was a big poster on the wall of Mussolini, I think it was Hirohito, and of course Hitler. And Mussolini was portrayed as a very big, fat, ugly guy. Hitler had his funny little mustache. And I very clearly remember the Japanese guy was like a little midget compared to those two. And he was yellow and had big round glasses and buck teeth like that. So it was definitely an uncomplimentary photo, and I think it said something like victory. But in those days, I couldn't read. I think it said AXIX. AXIS. Axis. That was victory over the Axis. Axis? Axis, yes. So the enemy was called the Axis. All right. So getting back to what life was like, in kindergarten, the one thing I can remember very well is the free lunch. Well, it wasn't much of a lunch. It was a hard-boiled egg and was kind of hard and almost rubbery, and it would stick in your throat. And it didn't feel good at all, but they gave you a little glass bottle of milk. It must have been what they call a half pint. And that glass bottle, that was long before there was such a thing as cartons. Cartons didn't exist. But there was a piece of cardboard round that held the milk in so it wouldn't spill, and that always smelled horrible. So you had to take that off, throw it away somewhere, and then have a bite of the hard-boiled egg and slug down some milk. And thinking back, of course, that was so the kids of that era wouldn't get, would be nourished. And I lived in a poor neighborhood, not upper class. It was a working class neighborhood. And so all the kids got this free lunch at lunchtime. So we didn't have to go home for lunch. Okay. Even as little kids, we were told we had to do our part to achieve victory. And looking back, it's pretty funny because I remember we were issued with black cardboards that had cutouts of the shapes of airplanes. So you pressed the cardboard and you got the shape of the fuselage, and then another press and you got wings, and you stuck the wings in the fuselage, and you had models of German bombers. I think they were called Stukas at the time. You had Spitfires, the British plane. You had an American plane. I forgot what it was called because the big important fighter hadn't yet been built. I think that was called the P-47. That came along later. But anyway, we had these black cardboard cutouts with the shapes of, must have been about a dozen different planes of the enemy and our own. And so that we would achieve victory here in the Midwest, 10,000 miles away from the front, the kids got these shapes and were told to go up on the mountains and, well, there was no real mountains, let's say hills, and hold those shapes up, and if a plane came by that was an enemy plane, well, you had to report it. They didn't even, I don't remember being told where to report it, but we were supposed to report those enemy planes flying over Iowa. Crazy now that I think about it. Okay. Then there was movies, but for some reason, little kids like me never were taken to movie. Oh, maybe I was. Maybe I saw Snow White or some Disney movie. But I remember my very first movie, very patriotic, was called The Commandos Strike at Dawn. It's funny, I'll bet all you people watching this probably remember the title of your very first movie. But I remember The Commandos Strike at Dawn, I think it was somewhere in Norway, and the commandos they were underwater and they had these like snorkel tubes. So they hid under the water and emerged in the morning, at dawn obviously, to attack the Nazis. Well, it was like in those days, all the news was always positive. The Germans and the Japanese were always losing, and the Americans were always winning, with one exception. I think that was years later. Something called the Battle of the Bulge. And I remember the reporting on that was a little bit interesting because it was kind of reported on radio. No, forget television. There was no television in those days. But on the radio, there was news of this last offensive of Hitler called the Battle of the Bulge. It was in Northern Europe. And it turns out, or at least it was reported at that time, that Hitler's forces had obtained a lot of American captured vehicles like tanks and trucks, and they put English-speaking Germans in these vehicles so that they could drive through the American lines pretending to be Americans in retreat, and then turned their guns on the Americans that they just left behind. All right, I think this might have happened, but what was interesting was we had newsreels in those days, and if you went to the movies, the newsreel showed that the Americans on the receiving end of these retreating forces that were really Germans would ask questions like, who was little orphan Annie's stepfather? Now, Little Orphan Annie was one of the favorite cartoons of the day, and everybody in the U.S. always read the color cartoons in the Sunday paper, which we used to call the funny papers. And Little Orphan Annie was one of the favorites, along with another one called Dick Tracy and Little Abner. So the question that only Americans would really know the answer to, who was Little Orphan Annie's stepfather, it was Daddy Warbucks, of course. Everybody knew that, but not the Germans. And then the other question was, what's the girlfriend of Little Abner? Well, all Americans would know that it was Daisy May. And there were other cartoons. Oh, there was the Katzenjammer Kids, which strangely enough, they were all Germans, but they were American Germans, so they were okay. And the Katzenjammer Kids, I think their dad was called Mr. Wallet. Well, in any event, that's how they supposedly stopped the Germans, at least according to the newsreel. And then eventually, a general called Patton, he was a big hero of the era. General Patton saved the day. The poor American troops who had been surrounded and were freezing to death and not supplied. Good old Patton came up from the south and defeated the Germans. As I said, the news was always good news. Now, the kids were very interested in always playing war games. I remember with the boys, we didn't get metal toys in those days. Nothing was made of metal for the people, because the metal all was going to the war effort. And then there was another strange thing I bet you don't remember, or unless you were there, was fat cans. When your mom made any kind of meat, whether it was roast duck or bacon or more likely pork, there was always a lot of fat left over. And also tin cans. So you were supposed to put your fat in the tin can and take that over to a war depot where they did something with it. I guess they made lubrication fluid out of the fat, and the tin cans were of course metal, so they became cartridge cases. Okay, so the kids, we had no concept of blood and pain, but we played with guns. Of course, the guns were made out of a wood or sometimes cardboard, and we would go bang, 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 and people would go, you got me. And we had a lot of fun, but I don't think the kids didn't take it too seriously. We never had any feeling of danger. In fact, I don't think any bombs ever hit the continental United States, except maybe one or two isolated ones in California that were dropped by, I think there was I think we heard about a submarine built by the Japanese that was like an aircraft carrier, but it only carried one airplane. So the submarine came up, it had one airplane. The airplane dropped some bomb in California. It didn't do much damage. Went back to the submarine, and I think that was the lone attack on continental USA. Okay, now here's something. We had rationing and price controls. Here's how that worked. Every month or so, Mom would go to the OPA, Office of Price Administration, along with everybody else, and she had like a little wallet that had several, what do you call it? Little compartments, and the compartments held different colored discs that were made out of, I think, pressed paper. And they were yellow discs and red discs and blue discs, and they were for meat, bread, dairy products. Well, anyway, these discs were for different products. And if you wanted to buy something at the grocery, you had to show this, you had to show your ration card and then have these little discs, because you were allowed maybe 100 grams of meat or a couple hundred grams of cereal. And so everything was price controlled, was quite cheap actually. You could afford stuff. And if you couldn't get something, everybody knew about the so-called black market. Everybody knew about the black market, and now I'm going to tell you how it worked in World War II. Pretty simple. We were in the Midwest, and if you took a drive, of course there were no cars and gasoline was rationed, so it wasn't so easy to take a drive. And forget about buying new cars. No new cars at all. I remember the expression was closed for the duration. So all the car dealers, just like in the COVID when the restaurants were closed, all the car dealers had a big sign, closed for the duration, which meant war, of course. All right, getting back to the black market. So the farmers would obviously have extra chickens, extra eggs, extra pigs, and they would be for sale at many times. I wasn't into economics in those days, but if an egg was a nickel, then an egg from the farmer, not price controlled, might have been 10 or 15 cents per egg. Obviously, in those days, we're talking about 1 cent versus 3 cents, because prices were quite a bit different. Okay, so the farmers would come in, and they did have special gas allowance, and they had trucks, and they would come in at certain times, and that was the black market. So anything you couldn't get with your ration coupons, there was not that much scarcity. If you wanted to have eggs and bacon and pork chops, you could get it on the black market. We did hear about people going to jail every once in a while for black market activities, but generally I think it was it went by with a wink and a smile. Okay, so as I said, you couldn't get any cars, and if you did have a car, your allowance of gas was limited to activities that had some bearing on the war effort. So that was production of food, production of ammunition. Almost all factories were turned into military suppliers. But I do remember there were no tires available, rubber tires for civilians. I think the tires were not artificial, made out of coal in those days, or petroleum. It was actually rubber from Malaysia. Malaysia rubber just wasn't available, so some very smart guys decided that they would cut up old used tires and somehow melt them down, and they used a process they called vulcanization. So they put a round piece of whatever this was, sort of rubber, I guess, melted down, reconstituted rubber, and that went around the worn out tires. So what you saw on the street a lot of times was these vulcanized pieces. When somebody had a flat tire, what we used to call a blowout, these vulcanized pieces would be all over the road. And horses didn't make much of a comeback, but people who sold vegetables, farmers, did have horse-drawn carts in those days. We're talking 1941, 1942, 1943. So people did revert to horses. Okay. Now, my mother, she grew up in Germany, strangely enough, and obviously it wasn't so good to be a German in the USA, but unlike World War I, where the Germans actually were put in, not concentration camps, but they were very much controlled. In World War II, the Germans were considered loyal Americans. And so my mother was left alone by police and so forth, but she was encouraged, and she did obtain American citizenship in that period. And once you were a German with American citizenship, you were cleared. I also remember that on the radio, the head of the FBI, who was a very respectable fellow before he was found out to be a transvestite after his death, but just J. Edgar Hoover announced that all students of first, second, and third grade could apply by mail for a junior G-Man badge. And that was considered a great honor, although all you had to do was have your dad write a letter to J. Edgar Hoover, please make my son or daughter, no, I guess it was only for men or boys, a junior G-Man. So I got a junior G-Man badge, and your duty was if you found any saboteurs or people wearing Nazi swastikas or evil Japanese, you were supposed to report them. Now, just like with the airplanes, I don't think we ever were told where to report these things, just to report them. I guess you tell your dad and he's supposed to tell the cops. But obviously, I never saw any German bombers and I never saw any saboteurs. So I wore my G-Man badge with pride, but never used it. Okay. Now, my mom, before she left Europe around the mid-30s, she had attended a parade where Hitler, in person, was standing in his Mercedes and waving at the crowd. And she said she just couldn't understand how everybody is going Heil Hitler and Heil Hitler. And she said the women were crying, and it was more than even a rock star today. People went crazy. She said, what the hell? This is just a kind of a guy, and he had bad teeth. He had a big golden tooth right here. Even in today's movies, you never see that. But my mother said, this guy has very bad teeth. And he's kind of a clown with his silly mustache. So obviously she was anti-fascist, and she didn't think Hitler was too important. Now, we knew Hitler, his big thing was he just hated Jews. Why, as a kid, I sure didn't know. But my dad said he planned to relocate all the Jews of Europe in Madagascar. Well, that's about all I remember. And maybe in part 2 of this talk, I'll talk more about what we knew about Hitler. Well, as I said, there was no TV. Forget it. We had the Voice of America, always positive news, and we listened to the war news every night. Everybody listened to that, and it was almost always positive. The Americans were beating the hell out of the Japanese, and I remember my dad saying, "Oh, those little wimps! America could tie its hands behind its back, and we'd have no trouble defeating them." But that was that was before the war really got serious. It turned out that they were rather formidable opponents, and it was known early on that they just didn't surrender ever. They just fought to the death, and if they were surrounded, they yelled out "Banzai" and ran into the machine guns, and bing bang boom, they were dead. Okay. Well, after the war, well, I said during the war, there were just no cars at all. But right after the war, my dad, who had saved up a lot of money, bought a Willys Jeep. It was not exactly Army surplus. It was made for civilians by the same factory that made Jeeps for the military. And this must have been 1945 when civilian production resumed. And I was very proud to be riding around in that Jeep. I pretended I was a soldier. And now that is the end of part 1. If you want to hear part 2 of a kid's memories of World War II, tune in. Or, well, actually, all you do is click on your YouTube and I'll talk about some more memories of World War II. So long.